Hello. There's a much discussed conundrum in ethics called the trolley problem, which has challenged common sense ideas about the significance of intuitive moral distinctions, such as the distinction between doing harm, for example, by deliberately running someone over with your car, and allowing harm, for example, by not jumping into the street to prevent someone from being hit by a car. In one version of the trolley example, we imagine that there's a runaway tram speeding down the tracks, which will kill 5 people unless it is switched to a different track, where it would instead kill 1 person. Here's a question. Should a bystander intervene and make the tram switch tracks, thereby killing 1, or should this bystander not intervene and thereby allow 5 to die? Ethicists have discussed these questions for many decades, but until recently the discussion was quite abstract. The creation of driverless cars may, however, force non-philosophers to grapple with these questions, because such cars will occasionally be confronted with life and death decisions. Recently, an ethicist in the University of Southampton Philosophy Department, Professor Fiona Woolard, has been applying her research on the ethics of doing and allowing harm to the important new practical problems raised by driverless cars. In this interview, I talked to Fiona to learn more about what moral philosophers like herself can learn from reflecting on driverless cars, and to explore the ethical problems that they raise. So to get us started, could you first tell the viewer a bit about yourself and explain how you got interested in this topic?
Thanks very much for having me. So my background is in the doing allowing distinction, what it is and its moral relevance. So is there a difference between pushing somebody off a cliff and so that they drown, and failing to rescue them when they're already drowning? And in that falls within an area of philosophy called deontological ethics, where we look at deontological distinctions and how they affect ethical issues, so what their moral relevance is. So there are quite a few different deontological distinctions, and the thought is, in most of them, they have, the point of them is that the way in which you're relevant to a harm can matter. So even if the harm is the same and the cost to you of avoiding it is the same, there can be moral differences, and that's what I think of as a deontological distinction. And if you work in that area, probably the most famous thought experiment is the trolley problem. So it's called the trolley problem, even though it was originally a tram, because the first person to come up with it was Philippa Foot, who's one of my favourite philosophers. My daughter's actually named after her. And she came up with this tram problem, where you're the driver of a car and the driver of a tram, and the tram is out of control. It's heading towards 5 people trapped on the track ahead of you, and you can switch the track where it will hit 1 innocent person, but you can't stop the tram. This was then turned into the trolley problem by Judith Jarvis Thomson, another of my favourite philosophers. She was American, so the tram became a trolley. And the trolley problem is probably the most famous thought experiment for people working in the area of kind of deontological distinctions. And when driverless cars came on the scene, people were saying, this is a real-life trolley problem. We face real-life trolley problems when it comes to driverless cars. So obviously, having spent quite a lot of my working life looking at trolley problems, I was really interested to see whether this was true. Is this really a real-life trolley problem? Can we apply all this work that people have been doing in deontological distinction philosophy to this exciting new area of technology? So that's what got me interested.
Wonderful. Can you now tell us what kinds of conclusions you've come to on whether that work can be applied to the case of driverless cars? So do you think that questions about the ethics of driverless cars can just be settled by using what we've kind of already been thinking about with the trolley problem, which you very nicely explained? Or is the problem that they raise, or the problems that they raise, are those different from the trolley problem in some important way?
So I think that we have to be extremely careful when we're trying to kind of move conclusions across from human trolley problems to driverless car cases. And the reason is that there's an incredibly important difference between human trolley problems and driverless car problems. In the human trolley problems, we imagine that the person making the decisions is a human agent. And I think all our kind of deontological thinking is based upon interactions between human agents. In the driverless car case, there are humans involved. There are human designers, there are human potential victims, but the thing that's making the decision at that point, the thing that will act, is not a human agent. And I think that makes a massive moral difference, because our understanding of the importance of these deontological distinctions is really based on human agents and ways in which human agency has ethical significance.
Wonderful. So is there then any way that we can apply concepts like the ones that we apply to human agents to the case of driverless cars, or do we need different concepts?
So what I actually think is really exciting is that I think how we apply these concepts is yet to be negotiated. So there isn't a single right answer which we're going to discover about how to apply these deontological distinctions to driverless cars. Instead, we as a society need to figure out, negotiate how we think about the behavior of these driverless cars. And there are some options that are incoherent. So some things can be ruled out, but there are a few different options which are kind of coherent and make sense, but yet give very different results.
Great. Could you say a bit more about that? So what are the options that you think are available to us?
Well, I think one thing that you could do is you could treat the driverless cars as if they were humans. So you could just, even though they aren't human agents, you could say we're going to treat them as if they are human agents and apply the deontological distinctions on that basis. So a kind of anthropomorphization of the driverless cars. Another option is to do what I think we do with cars that are driven, which is we see. So I think cars that are driven are, in fact, an example of our ethical concepts stretching in the past.
Interesting, yeah.
Because we apply deontological distinctions to the actions of cars. So, for example, if you're a driver in a car and your car is moving along very fast and you just take your hands off the wheel and you don't do anything and the car hits somebody, we will say you killed that person, you hit them with your car. We won't say, oh, you allowed that person to die. So we see the car's motions, the car's behavior as attributable to a human agent, and that agent is the person in the driving seat. So the question is going to be, with driverless cars, is there a person who we can see for whom we can see the driverless car as a kind of extension of their body, in the way that we see a car that's been driven by somebody as kind of an extension of their body. And so, of course, there are possible candidates: the owner of the car, the passenger, the person who's in the car and who said, this is where I want to go, the designers of the car, maybe the people making the regulations about what the car could do. So there are various different people who we might see as as playing the same role as the driver of the car, people to whom we might attribute the motion or the behavior of the car. However, the problem is, because there's so many possible people who we might hold responsible, that might make us hesitant to hold any one of them responsible. So this might make it less likely that we'll take that kind of option.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Do you think that that's a difference in kind with other examples of technology where you can think of there as being several people involved? I mean, even with cars, you could think of the designers to some degree as being responsible with certain events that might happen with cars that have drivers. So I guess there's a question then about whether we might be able to work with the way that we've already extended our concepts in the case of cars with drivers and just abstract a bit more, generalize a bit from that, or whether there are kind of too many agents that are now involved so that we just do need to do something different.
It's a little bit difficult to say because I grew up with cars being driven around. So my own moral concepts have been formed after the negotiation had taken place. To me, it seems as if the person who's driving the car is in control of the car is really a kind of the natural person to see as the person to whom you attribute the motions of the car. And it seems as if there's a difference there between that case and the driverless car case, because it just seems as if the driver really stands out, whereas it doesn't seem to me as if you have such a standout candidate in the driverless car case. But it is hard to say whether that seems to me to stand out because I grew up with that way of thinking and the negotiation had already happened. So I don't know whether there will be a point, if we were talking in 2021, whether, my great-grandchildren, I'm not sure how many greats, whether they would say, well, the thing about driverless cars is that it's so obvious that this person is the standout candidate, or whether it'll still seem as if there is that element of choice and that kind of lots of people. What seems to happen in the driverless car case is that you have lots of people playing different but kind of equally important roles, and nobody with control. Control at that moment by moment reaction control, which seems to be the thing that makes the driver in the driven car stand out.
No, that's very helpful, because I guess I was thinking about with trains or airplanes, we might think of in those cases there being a bit more distribution of the responsibility, whereas it seems like in the case of your own car, clearly you should just hold the driver responsible. But I guess the fact then that there is no agent at all in charge is what seems to create the challenge. So I guess that then does make it seem kind of deeply different from other kinds of examples that we've thought about. Although I guess in some of the versions of the trolley case, the driver of the trolley has passed out, and we have the bystander at the switch, for example. So I guess it'd be interesting to think about whether there might be some existing versions of the trolley problem where we might be able to work out some kind of parallel intuitions.
I tried to come up with some. I tried to work out some ones which would be really parallel, and it was so difficult because I think I mean, it depends on what, because there are different versions of driverless cars. So, do you have a passenger in the driverless car or do you not have a passenger? That makes a difference. But one of the versions that I was trying to come up with, you had to have something that was a trolley where somebody was trapped inside the trolley. It got very complicated. And here's another thing that we have to be very careful with, because these thought experiments are designed to use our intuitions about one type of case to reach conclusions about another type of case. And that means that they only work if you have clear intuitions about the type of case you're trying to use. And the problem is that if you mess about with the trolley problem, the trolley cases too much, they end up being really far removed from anything that we've got experience of, and your intuitions become less trustworthy. And some people will just look at that and they will say, I have no intuition at all. Other people will have really strong intuitions, but even when somebody has a strong intuition, there's a worry. Is that intuition driven by the theory that they've accepted, or is it the intuition being used to help them understand the theory, to get hold of the theory? So what role does the intuition play? So I think I think we have to be doubly careful when we're using trolley problems to think about driverless car cases. First, we have to be careful that we've got a genuine match, like something that really is an analog of the driverless car case. And then we have to be careful that we don't have a case where we can no longer trust our intuitions. So good.
Right. So maybe we just have to work out these problems first in real life, and then we can begin to think about what the analogies might be. Is that kind of roughly the way that you think we should go, or?
So actually, I guess I think one thing that we can do is we can think about, if we accept this rule for driverless cars, what will that imply for various cases, real life cases, and would we be happy with that? So that's one way to do it.
Okay, good.
Another, I mean, but so I think sometimes these analogies can be useful. Another thing that we can do is to just move from thinking, well, we think we've discovered that this simplified version shows that a certain distinction matters, and then we think, do we want this distinction to matter in the driverless car case? So rather than kind of reading off the results of a case, we say, well, this case shows that we treat this distinction as significance when it comes to human ethics. How do we want to translate that significance to the driverless car case? So it involves more kind of negotiation and more argument.
Excellent.
About what we want to actually treat as morally relevant.
Great. So maybe now we can start to talk about how we should resolve this by your lights. And here it might be worthwhile just backing up first and being clear about the different sorts of driverless cars that we might have in mind. So as I understand it, there are at least two kinds of cases to think about. There's, on the one hand, the case of pre-programmed driverless cars. And on the other hand, there are driverless cars that might rely on artificial neural networks that are trained. So could you say a bit about the problems that we face in each case? And if you were in charge of designing these cars, what would you do?
Okay, so the problem is, this relates to a paper that my colleague Will McNeil and I have been working on, and in it we suggest that there's a kind of a tension when it comes to driverless cars. You face a choice between two kind of unpalatable options. So when it comes to pre-programmed driverless cars, if you're going for like the top-down approach, then what you do is you basically try to give it some principles and say you must decide, you must work on these principles. So this is how you make the decisions. The problem is that none of the plausible ethical theories work like that. None of them give us a decision procedure. That's why you don't see real people kind of getting out calculators when they're trying to decide what to do, or kind of looking up the answer in a big book, because there isn't a decision procedure that comes out of any plausible ethical theory. That you always need judgment, and you need judgment in working out, what are the relevant moral features, how do they weigh up against each other, these sorts of things. The one that looks closest to giving us a decision procedure is consequentialism or utilitarianism, but so direct act utilitarianism, which says do the act which produces the best outcome. But that's not a decision procedure which you can apply without judgment, because you need judgment to work out what the best outcome would be. So if we tried to do that top-down pre-programmed driverless cars, I think we would inevitably end up with inaccuracy. So we would end up with the cars sometimes doing the wrong thing. So the alternative is to use artificial neural networks that are trained. The problem with that is that then you don't have any top-down principles. You have something like judgment. It learns how to do ethics. But then you have a kind of black box. You don't know the principles on which it's making its decisions. And we've seen in several real life cases that when you have an algorithm making decisions that's been trained, it can take in and even amplify the biases that are in the material it's been trained on. So you end up with, for example, racist algorithms. So that's a big concern. So we have this kind of choice between kind of inaccuracy and a sort of black box, lack of transparency, not knowing what the principles are on which important life or death decisions are being made. And neither of those sounds particularly great as an option. You asked what I would do. I mean, one thing is, and there has been work on this to try and open up the black box, to try and design a trained neural network that can explain what basis it's making its decisions on. So that would be promising if that could work. There are some concerns about whether you could trust the thing that was reporting, whether it would be rationalization. I'm kind of, in a way, my position is a bit like my position with the deontological distinctions, in that I'm not sure there's a single right answer. I think it's really important that we as a society are aware of kind of what's at stake, and so can have debate about how to balance these competing issues. And of course, it's going to depend a lot on the kind of the details of the case and what precisely you are. What exactly is it? A driverless car, or is it a healthcare allocation? What are we talking about precisely? So I think there was a related question, which was, do you think moral philosophers should be in charge of the?
Yes. Yeah. No. That was another question that I was going to follow up with.
And so my answer to that would be no, not in charge. I think what moral philosophers are really great at doing is kind of pointing out these are the things that are at stake. If you say this is what you're kind of committing yourself to in other areas. these are the important distinctions that we need to draw to get to think clearly about these problems. But I think it should be a society wide debate and discussion and decision. That's what I would prefer.
Yeah, and is that mainly just because it would be paternalistic to do otherwise, or is there like a unique reason why in this case you want to say that?
I think it's partly because I see it as not a correct answer that we have to discover.
Right. Yes.
Which so it's making a decision about how we should act, and so it seems as if the decision belongs to.
I see. Yeah. So it might be that we say to the general public, you should be deontologists, not utilitarians. But in order to be able to apply deontological principles, we're going to have to invent these new concepts, and that will then be a kind of collective decision. So is that then the way that it would go?
Yeah. I mean, of course, everybody should be deontologists.
Yes, exactly.
Not utilitarians. But yeah, here it's how do we apply? How do we be deontologists when it comes to driverless cars?
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's very helpful. Can I just go back briefly to the dilemma? Because we didn't get to talk in detail or much about that. So one question that I had was just, why should we think that there would be so much inaccuracy that we would want to rule out the pre-programmed option? Because there is something kind of unpalatable about the black box option without reliable descriptions of what it's doing. And I guess you might think, I mean, there's going to be some level of error in any kind of human technology. So as long as we can keep it below a certain threshold, then maybe it would just be better to go with the pre-programmed cars option.
Yeah, so I think that might be right. I mean, it might be that what we decide is that it's much more important to have transparency than to have accuracy.
Good.
It's going to depend upon how much inaccuracy there's going to be. And I think that is going to depend upon the specifics of what the AI is doing.
Yeah.
So it could be if it's something that's doing a very focused job, we might be able to get it really pretty accurate. There's been some really interesting work. I think it's by Anderson and Anderson, trying to use AI to come up with. So this is sort of up. It's not quite top down, because what they do is they put in the decisions that healthcare professionals would make, and then trained the AI to then come up with principles. So it extracted the principles and refined them. So you could then see what it was, and then you use those principles to come in. So that's, I mean, it does depend on trusting that the inputs are correct.
Right.
But if it's something really very focused, then we might be able to do that. If it's something that's moving around in lots of different situations, and I think driverless cars might fall into that category, then it might be harder. There might be more things to weigh up. There also might be things that are morally relevant, which it's hard for the car to even detect, which adds in a different issue. Here's also, I think there's one reason to be worried about inaccuracy in this area, which is different from just the general problem with all human technology being fallible. It seems somehow worse to suffer a harm because society has decided to program a moral principles into driverless cars, which then harm you in a way that's wrong. That seems worse than just, suffering a harm because some technology doesn't work, other technology fails in a kind of normal way technology fails. So I think we do have kind of reason to be more concerned about ethical errors, about the car doing things that are unjust. But then it might be that we think, yes, that's true, those are bad, but it's even worse not to know the principles on which these decisions are being made, and to fear that they're being made unjustly and not to be able to check.
Right. That's very helpful. Yeah, so I guess that does bring us then to this question about how responsibility works, and it seems like perhaps it just works differently depending on which kind of driverless car we're thinking about, because it sounded like from the answer that you were just giving that if we did work with pre-programmed driverless cars, then a lot of responsibility would kind of intuitively be felt to fall on the programmers, so that might then allow us to resolve to some extent the question of who should be blamed in a case in which the car does something that we think wasn't the right thing to do, or just makes some other sort of mistake.
Yeah, I mean, you hear different kind of suggestions about how these kind of ethical, how the ethics of driverless cars would work. Would you have options to, like, you could go into a shop and say, I want a deontological driverless car, or I want a driverless car that is, an ethical egotist and only acts in my interest. And you can kind of see that in that case, a lot of the responsibility would fall on the buyer.
Yeah. Right.
But I just don't think you should be able to go into a shop and buy a driverless car that will systematically protect the passengers over pedestrians.
Yeah, absolutely.
That doesn't seem right. So I think there needs to be kind of control over what kind of ethical systems can be included, can be sold, can be put into these driverless cars and made available. So that means that there is kind of governmental responsibility to make the regulations that govern what is available in the shops, and then if things go wrong, who's going to be responsible to blame? That's going to be a very difficult question. It's going to be, did we get the regulations wrong?
Yeah.
Was there a problem with the design of the car, which meant that we thought it was going to obey the regulations, but it didn't, or there were unexpected consequences?
Yeah.
I think it's really going to depend on the details of the case, but it's going to be complicated.
Yeah. So it does also, it seems like it will depend a lot on how confining the regulations are. Because I guess if the buyer doesn't have much control over the sort of ethical approach that is used by the car, then it would be much more difficult to think of them as being responsible. And I guess in that case, do you think would it be the government, or would it be the companies, or some combination of them that would then be responsible for the effects?
So I think probably in a way both, although it might, governments are going to be responsible for the general consequences of the regulations that are eventually decided upon. This might, when I say governments, it might actually end up being kind of an international thing. In fact, you hope it will be agreed upon internationally. So that those making the regulations will have responsibility for the implications of the regulations. But when something goes wrong, we'll need to ask sort of why did it go wrong?
Yeah.
Was it a problem with the regulations that should have been foreseen by the people who made the regulations, or was it a problem with the implementation? And I mean, it may be that it's not actually, you know, we have something's gone wrong, but nobody's ultimately to blame, because there hasn't, you know, that there was every reasonable effort was made to have the program match the regulations, and it was just wouldn't have been possible. So yeah, it really will depend on the details of the case.
Yeah, no, that all makes sense. Maybe to go back to one other question about how specifically reflection on driverless cars has affected the way that you think about the deontological distinctions that we kind of started off talking about.
I think that one thing that it has done is deepened my sense that there is some element of convention in our application of deontological principles. And I mean, I always thought that there was some element of convention, because I think that these deontological principles often depend upon what belongs to people.
Yeah.
As mine, and what counts as yours, and what counts as interfering with somebody else. So that brings in convention. But it's just, I think that what the driverless car shows is that there's kind of a whole new element of convention when we get these cases where objects act, and we see objects as kind of as we try and apply the deontological distinctions to the action of objects. And I think that's actually really interesting, not just in the driverless car case, but also in the more familiar kind of objects, to see what's at stake and at play when we're thinking about the action of objects.
Right. So going back just to that point that we had made at the beginning about cars with drivers, there was a point at which we had to kind of extend our deontological concepts to be able to cover that case. So that is then the kind of thing that we would be doing. It's just more complicated because of the fact that there's no agent. Good. So the kinds of revisions that we might end up seeing then would at least kind of follow a familiar sort of pattern. Like, it would be easy to imagine what it is that we might end up saying if we had, a driverless car that was trained and that had a passenger in it, and so on. And then maybe once we filled in all of the details, we would then be able to say whether we should think of what happened in that case as a case of doing or allowing harm, or something else.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. And just to make that other question that we were just discussing more precise then, are there ways that you've thought about the technology evolving that have made you change your own views about how these deontological distinctions should be applied? Like, is there a way that you could see the future of driverless cars going that would put pressure on some of the beliefs that you've defended?
I don't think so. I think that there are a few different ways that it could go, and there are some where I think that would be a mistake, but I think the others are broadly compatible with my general thinking.
Okay, right.
Logical distinctions, so they wouldn't require kind of massive revision.
Yeah.
I guess the way that I think about it is I think I've looked at the doing allowing distinction, and I've kind of looked at kind of the core fairly core cases with some branching off cases which have involved removal of barriers.
Yes, yeah.
And I think that what thinking about driverless car cases shows is that it's really, there's much more to be filled in. There's much more complexity there.
Yeah.
So it's not that I need to like chop the tree down. The trunk is still there and it's still good. It's just, there are all these branches that need to be kind of drawn in, and sometimes the branches are actually being added on. They're not there to be discovered, which is quite exciting.
Yeah. No, that is very exciting. Well, I look forward to seeing how they get added on in your work. Thank you so much for talking to us, or talking to me, and talking to the viewer of this video eventually. But perhaps we should call it a day.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been really fun talking about this.